Well, the other day, one of my good friends, Kerrigan McCarthy, who shares my interest in Eastern Cape 19th century history, told me after church that she was busy reading the biography of Monica Hunter Wilson and asked me if I had a copy of the classic book Reaction to Conquest that she had written in 1936. It was in fact the first major anthropological study of the AmaMpondo. And I remembered that while I was writing my own book on the history of the AmaMpondo, I had in fact interviewed Professor Francis Wilson, her son, in 2009, and he had brought this remarkable woman to life. So I promised Kerrigan I would find the footage and get it to her to watch. It took me back to the very pleasant hours I'd spent in Francis's home in Rondebosch, Cape Town, 13 years ago, and the conversation we had had before and after the camera was rolling. He was at the time in the final throes of finishing a manuscript for a book that his publishers had commissioned him to author, so we had to curtail the conversation after 2 hours. We could have gone on all day. And he told me that the book was a history of South Africa of only 10,000 words, written for the benefit of visitors anticipated to be arriving in South Africa for the 2010 FIFA World Cup. I marveled at his determination to compress such a vast span of history into only 10,000 words. And as soon as Dinosaurs, Diamonds and Democracy, a short history of South Africa, hit the shelves, I bought it. I was very impressed, and I have now the second edition, but I see it's now into a third updated edition already. And then literally, after I'd taken the book off my bookshelf, and while it was sitting on my desk for Kerrigan, she WhatsApped me with the news that Francis Wilson had passed away. Well, that synchronicity spurred me to make this video available to his friends and family as a tribute to this remarkable man. And then interesting, while working on the re-edit, there was another convergence of synchronicity and an excellent obituary by Pippa Green. A heart on fire with a mind on ice, economist Francis Wilson believed mining is the core to understanding South Africa. Well, that encapsulation is extremely apt because, as you will see in this conversation with Francis 13 years ago, he helped me realize, while the whole Kolobeni mining rights saga, which I was deeply immersed in, was so important to watch closely and write about as an emblematic story of mining in South Africa, hoping that the succession of ministers of minerals and the ANC government would learn from history, understand the appalling injustices that Francis helped expose as an economist and historian, and to hope that they would be resolved in policy making and practice to make sure they were not repeated in the democratic era. Now, this is one of my first attempts at filmmaking, and I was still early in the learning curve, so pardon the blemishes. However, content-wise, it is extremely interesting with the benefit of hindsight, because I spliced the conversation with Francis with cutaways with my other teacher in Mpondo history and culture, Sinagugu Zugulu, who gives a unique history lesson on the causes of the 1960 Mpondo revolt and explains how Francis's mother, Monica Hunter Wilson, helped shape his historical consciousness of his own ancestral roots. Now, Sinagugu was one of the first of the local residents of the Amadiba community to recruit me to their reaction to another conquest, this time by the CEO of an Australian mining company, MRC, named Mark Caruso, who had, with eager encouragement from the former DG of Department of Minerals, Sandile Nontlina, set their sights on mining the ancestral lands of the AmaMpondo along the Wild Coast dunes for heavy minerals. Well, the history lesson from Sinagugu was filmed on location in Nguza Hill, which has become the focus of the memorial to those who were killed in the Mpondo revolt of 1960. We filmed it in anticipation of the 50th anniversary of that tragedy, which has proved to be highly consequential in South African history in general, and the Amadiba community in particular. There are dozens of films on my YouTube channel which cover the story. In November 2018, we believed that the conquest by Mark Caruso and Sandile Nontlina had been successfully repelled by the Amadiba without recourse to violence, when the High Court found that the Bill of Rights obliged the state to obtain the free, prior and informed consent of local residents before mining rights could be awarded. The historical facts of the tragedy of the Mpondo revolt We're very much in the consciousness of the court, thanks to our advocate, Tembeka Nkwekwebe, and we were spared the repeat of a history. The AmaMpondo are fiercely attached to their land. You don't mess with that. Well, successive ministers of minerals pretend not to know that because it complicates their argument as to why the Xolobeni mining proposal would be a good thing. They can't allow history to get in the way of the future. Well, I think Sinagugu Francis Wilson and his mother, Monica, would all agree that history will tend to obstruct our future, but only to the extent that it is not known, owned, and deeply understood. Well, may the soul of Francis Wilson rest in peace, and rest in the knowledge that he has served many, many people in South Africa in the quest of understanding and owning our history, lest it repeats itself. So I hope this tribute will enable many more to do that now, besides being a consolation to his wife, Lindy, and their children, David, Jessica, and Tanya, his brother Tim, who has also become a friend, and all the rest of the family and friends of Francis who are grieving his departure.
I grew up in a very unusual home for a white South African because Monica had been born at Lovedale, where her parents had lived for, well, by the time I was born, they'd lived there for over 40 years as missionaries at the great educational institution. Monica had been brought up there, was at school with Frida Bokwe, who was the person who married Z.K. Matthews. And Frida and Monica were friends for life, and so she knew all kinds of people through that connection. And she became an anthropologist because she realized, she started studying history, but she realized that all the history of South Africa was written from the colonial side, and that there was very little written from the side of those who had been conquered. So she decided the only way to deal with that was to learn anthropology and to be an anthropologist and to go off into the field. So she went, I mean, she's known as an anthropologist, but in point of fact, her motivation was history. And so that her first big book, Reaction to Conquest, which is a study of the AmaMpondo, and tells you a lot about their social life and love of the land and all that kind of stuff, is also in search of the history. And she subsequently was co-editor, as you know, with Leonard Thompson of the Oxford History of South Africa, which really marked a watershed in the shift of history from just history from 1652 as seen by whites to a much deeper, more inclusive history of South Africa as a whole. Now, of course, that's moved on a long way since the Oxford History was published, but it was a breakthrough at the time. And so, in a funny way, Reaction to Conquest, which is an anthropological book and seen as one of the great classic studies of South African society, of the AmaMpondo, was itself part of a process of getting a deeper history and understanding of South African society.
Because I took an anthropology as an additional subject, and actually anthropology and history, I ended up getting more marks for those two subjects than geography, which was my specialty, because I ended up getting more interest out of history and anthropology. And I ended up actually taking up lecturing anthropology. I was doing anthropology 1, but because I was so passionate about the thing to explain, because Pondoland was one of the case studies, such that I was invited even to teach in the evening classes. So I would teach the day classes, and then I would be invited to come and do presentation for the evening.
What was your relationship with Yanni Smuts?
Well, we used to chaff a lot about that, of course. You know, what was she doing hobnobbing with General Smuts? And I would take with a pinch of salt his claim that he directed her there. But the story is as follows. In those days, if you were a student in England, you took the boat, your Union Castle boat, out to Southampton and came back again. And on one of those trips, I don't know which one, Smuts was on board. We're now talking about 1933, I would guess, or thereabouts. And so, very famous, well-known and so on. He was travelling first class. But Smuts being Smuts, and this is an interesting insight into him, of course, really was bored by all those first-class passengers, and he was much more interested in coming through to steerage to talk to the students. So they used to have these long discussions. He used to come through and have discussions with the students, which is kind of a nice insight into Smuts. And that's how Monica got to know him. And so when her book was nearly ready, somebody said to her, she'd never have done it on her own, somebody said, listen, get General Smuts to write a foreword. And she said, don't be ridiculous. They said, yeah, no, do. And he wrote it, which was very nice because obviously that helped the book get better known and so on. He was a literary person himself. He read, and I'm sure he read the book and thought it was good. Mm. But she was a Lovedale girl. I mean, she'd grown up at Lovedale, and through Lovedale, she had connections all over South Africa. Because don't forget that Lovedale itself started life in 1841 with 11 black and 9 white pupils. And she was part of a non-racial school when she grew up. So that when, for example, she was doing her fieldwork for Reaction to Conquest in East London, and that was politically quite tense, a young white woman going into the township to ask questions and so on. And she got clearance from people like Clemens Kadali of the ICU. So she was very well connected in that way. And through Frida, she knew Z.K. Matthews very well. In fact, she taught for ZK at Fort Hare. That was her first teaching job after my father died and so on. So she knew the African leadership extremely well, whether it was the ICU or the ANC, or indeed more broadly. I mean, I can remember her, she once went to give evidence in a Poko PAC trial here in the Western Cape, where she was asked by the PAC people if she wouldn't please come and give some expert evidence, which she did. So that she was very well aware of the political streams without being herself a particularly political person. I mean, she was a scholar, she was fascinated by her research work, but, you know, she was an activist in her own quiet way and on the right non-apartheid side. Yeah.
Now, did she have any comment, or was anything written subsequent to the Pondo uprising in 1959 and 60?
Not on Pondoland. You see, she, after Pondoland, she did 2 other important studies as far as Xhosa speakers are concerned. One was in the Kaskamahuk district, which is not that far from King Williamstown, so that's further south. And there she and an old childhood friend, Desmond Horton, who was an economist at Rhodes, put together a 4-volume study. There were a lot of people involved, Lindsay Robb and Eddie Mountain and others, a 4-volume study on a particular part, a particular area of black South Africa, again rural. And she did a very important book there on land tenure, and another one on social structure. Those were her 2 books. I think that's correct. And then Desmond did one on the economy, and Eddie Mountain did one on geography and water and all that stuff. That series never really got the publicity or knowledge it should have done, because it's a very important study, but it came out in the early 50s, and there was no way that the regime that was then in operation in this country was interested in what they were saying there, because they were talking about landlessness and poverty and what had happened in that area. So that was her second big study. Her third one was an urban study here in Cape Town, where she worked with a master's student of hers, Archie Mafeji, who subsequently became very well known. And Archie was a brilliant field worker, and of course also with his home language, and he could go through Langa like nobody else could. So the 2 of them got going. And she was his supervisor and helped with questions and so on. Archie went into the field, and the 2 of them together then published a book called Langa. So, and that of course also would have Pondo overtones in the sense that there are Pondo people down in the Cape, although they tended to go, Pondo is quite far north from Cape Town, they tended to go primarily to the gold mines, and of course a number of them to the sugar plantations and into Natal, fewer of them to Cape Town. But insofar as we are talking about Xhosa society, whether it is Pondo or Baka or whatever it may be, she knew the whole scene extremely well because she had done her fieldwork. Indeed, her reaction to conquest fieldwork, which is technically Pondo, the deep rural was Pondo, but then she was working on the farms in the Adelaide district and in the urban areas in East London. So it wasn't all strictly Pondo.
Yes, yeah.
There was quite a lot going on at that time, at the time of the Pondo Uprising and so on, because there's, Governor Mbeki's book, of course, The Peasant Revolt, and then I didn't know about the Turok work, but I'd like to read that. And then, of course, Drum Magazine, of all people, were actively involved. And I can remember hearing wonderful stories from Jim Bailey, because Drum was being charged with, I don't know, breaking some law by publishing stuff. I mean, freedom of the press question. And Jim had a wonderful story about having to go down to court in Port St. John, somewhere, and arriving, and he said there were thousands of Pondo horsemen all ready to come and support him if necessary in court. But I don't quite know the details of that. But it was there was a lot going on. Yes, no, I would certainly go and check out Drum in that 1959-62 period.
The hill behind me, across the stream, is the infamous Muza Hill, which was that's where the peak or the climax of the Pondo Revolt of the 1959 to 1962 or 61 culminated. And it was on top of that hill where the peaceful marchers or people, Pondo people, the men from all over they were meeting there to discuss the way forward in terms of all the problems that were faced with in as far as the annexation and the control of Pondo land by the apartheid regime. You see, actually what was happening was that the Pondo Revolt was about the people of Pondo land who were fed up about the apartheid system which was controlling them, about the control, because people wanted their freedom from being controlled by the regime in Pretoria. But the anger was directed towards the chiefs who have then become the objects of oppression, or that was being used by the regime to oppress the people. What happened was that this territory of Transkei was given so-called in as a self-governing territory, and a council was formed up in Umtata, which was sitting in the Punga building, or the parliament building in Umtata. And this Punga or council was made up of the chiefs of all these territories. And so Pondoland, like all the other territories, was represented by these chiefs in Umtata. So government was using these chiefs, therefore, imposing all the policies, legislations that the government wanted to see in place, even in terms of taxation and all that. So people then realized that, so the chiefs were no longer serving the people, but they were serving the government, because they were bringing all these policies, but were taking nothing from the people to the government, but everything from the government to the people. One of those policies, of course, would be the betterment scheme. If you are looking above the vehicle there, you can actually see the nucleated settlement there. So people were required to live in nucleated settlements instead of the scattered settlement you see across the valley here. This is the traditional settlement in Pondoland. So people wanted to maintain this kind of settlement, to live in dispersed settlement so that there will be enough grazing and all that. And the government wanted them to live in nuclear. So this was called betterment scheme. And then, so people hated that because they were required to reduce the stock numbers, their livestock, to cut down the numbers in order to be able to live in this. When the chiefs were in the bunga or in the council in Umtata, the chief magistrate there or the government officials presented them with two bags, one filled up with soil representing the land, another one filled up with money. Then the chiefs were asked to choose. All the chiefs, they chose the money bag instead of the soil, which was representing the land, except two, which was the chief of Imizizi. There was another one in the Flagstaff area, I cannot remember who the chief was. But only two chiefs chose the land. So then it was, so the news spread out that chiefs have sold away the land and chose the money. And then people therefore began to boycott chiefs. They did not trust them as they are. So the people wanted to elect their own representatives to go to the Ipunga, so who would take the views and the ideas and the needs of the people to the Bunga, because chiefs were not doing that. So as a result, the meetings, therefore, to discuss these matters were held on hilltops. And Inguza Hill is one of those. There's another one in Ndlovu, which is in Bizana. There's also Unongulwana Hill. There's also the other one within Lupijin area. Also, when they were meeting here, then the police came from Flagstaff, and then there were helicopters who came in and then coming because people were said to be rebelling against the government. But the people meeting there raised white flags. Some of them, of course, they were on horseback and all that. So, and then the shootout broke out and then 13 people were killed.
Some thoughts about subsidiarity, funny term.
Well, I think that what we're really talking about, I would, instead of the word subsidiarity, I would talk about the word democracy. Now, as I understand what democracy is about, is that the people themselves have power to influence their lives. And democracy does not simply mean allowing people sort of 10 levels higher up take that decision-making capacity out of your hands. And so it's really fleshing out what we mean by a democratic society. And in your words, subsidiarity, whereby one is simply saying local people make local decisions as to how their lives are going to be led. And there's a wonderful book called The Powers of 10, which is a physics book, where they take a photograph of people at 10 meters from the ground, at 10 to the 2 meters and 10 to the 3, and then they go the other way, 10 to the minus 1, 10 to the minus 2, and 10 to the minus 14. You're down with the quarks and the mesons. Now, this is the same reality at whatever level you're looking at. And I think we've got to do a lot more thinking, and now I'm talking to development economists, at different levels, that we tend to think that everything can be decided and worked out and theorized about at, let's say, the national level. Whereas in point of fact, a lot of stuff has to happen at a much more local level, let's say the Tumi Valley level, where the problems come into focus in a way they don't come into focus if you're thinking at a national level. So I would argue that in this, all our thinking about how to create a better world, we've got to be asking ourselves all the time, are we looking at this thing at all the different appropriate levels? And my answer to that is no, we're not. We're focusing on one or two key levels, like the national level, the international level, and we're very seldom getting down to the nitty-gritty of what's going on down at 10 to the minus 2, 10 to the minus 5.
Yeah. Then a large number of people from Poland, of men, because it was mainly the men who were involved in this. And in general, all over Poland, people were no longer sleeping at home, but they would sleep in the forest, in the valleys, because they were scared of persecution and people would be arrested during the night. So the men were here. But after those ones were killed, the rest were arrested to an extent that you had a number of people, more than 20 people who were hanged in 1962, and whose names are therefore listed on the monument. Another 12 is in Bizana. There are 2 more who still have not yet been exhumed and brought back. So those ones who were hanged in Pretoria, the bodies have since been returned, exhumed and returned back here. You have got 13 graves which are situated within, next to the memorial there. You have got another 12 in Bizana and all over the place. And then a commemoration of this. And and it's a very significant event in Pondoland, which is still shaping the behavior and the decisions taken in Pondoland today in as far as the land issues concerned.
What's interesting from Ben Turok's perspective is that he, coming from a more kind of Marxist orientation economically, was because the assumption had always been that the social revolution would happen among the urban proletariat, and here we had a rural peasantry who were the first to actually take up issue, and that's what impressed him. But I'd be interested to know, from your point of view, whether the Pondo revolt and the issues that it raises about rural economy.
From my perspective on that, number one is when one talks about the Pondo as a rural people, you're near, yes and no. Of course they're rural, deep rural, but I mean this is where there's been a migrant labor system operating for the previous, well, if we're looking at it now, for 100 years or so, but I mean even in 1960, for perhaps 2 generations, and people have been going to the mines, and that itself has a huge impact on social consciousness. So I would, in reading Ben Turok's piece, I would like to ask to what extent the migration perspective has been brought into the analysis, because I think that's very important. Just one sort of simple observation is that the proportion of people who are landless varies a great deal around the country, and obviously that proportion has been rising. I mean, in Kanskamahuk, the proportion of landless was already something like 30%, I think, in 1950 or so. Pondoland wouldn't have been as high as that. So one is the degree of complete landlessness. Secondly is what is the average size of holding, and that will vary a great deal. The third point is just to raise an issue that none of us really understand at the moment, which has to do with land. That is this, that if you look up that eastern side of South Africa, starting from, let's say, the Fish River, and go up all the way through the old Ciskei, the old Transkei, KZN, up to the Tugela and so on, you will find far less arable agriculture than there used to be 20 years ago. Far less. Mealies are not being planted. There are a dozen different hypotheses as to why this is the case, but we are faced with a situation where land is very much sought after and needed, but is it for a security reason rather than to have some kind of security of tenure, to have a place where you can live, rather than for a productive reason?
That the whole of this used to be cultivated lands, but not anymore because of the old age pension. Now, just because of the too many social grants, it's one of the richest lands in South Africa.
And for me, one of the big developmental, if I can use that word for a moment, developmental questions in the country right now is how does one get land that is essentially available more productively used than it is being used. And that's a big issue in the country.
But now, the Pondo revolt, as I understood it, was a consequence of the Tomlinson Commission and the whole issue of betterment planning. And Ben Turok, in his little pamphlet, makes the clear contrast between the eastern and the western Pondoland. In the western Pondoland, where the betterment had already sort of taken hold, it was not as productive as he found in the eastern Pondoland, where they were still undisturbed, where the people had risen up against their chiefs who were going to supposedly sell out. I'd be interested in terms of now your own experience in this, the Carnegie Commission, the whole poverty studies, because where you see things going in terms of the important challenges we face.
Well, you see, it seems to me patently obvious. It's hardly rocket science, this, but we live in a country where the unemployment rate is, 30%, 40%, depending on how you define it. In some of the rural areas, 50% or more. And there is no indication whatever that the current economy, i.e. more motor cars being produced in some town or other and being exported to China, is going to produce all the jobs we need. So what we're really wrestling with, and it's a deep question, is how does one enable people who are, let's say, in terms of income distribution at the bottom, the lower 50% of our society, how does one create an economy or enable them to create an economy which can generate a reasonable standard of living for themselves right there? Now, a place like Pondoland, where not that long ago, and maybe even now in some parts of it, people have found ways of using the resources that are there. Well, if it ain't broke, don't try and fix it. work with that. Further south in the, say, rural Ciskei, like let's take Kamhok, I mean, that's badly broken. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to try and enable people to generate wealth. And, my own interest in the Tumi Valley, which is between Fort Hare and Hoxback, which has got 20,000 people living in it. Now, that is a valley where for 100 years the British came in and beat everybody up and basically took the land, and we're talking about the Eastern Cape generally, and messed up the society no end. Then came the great cattle killing, the disaster of all of that, and the discovery of diamonds and gold, and people then spent the next 100 years, I'm simplifying, going off as migrants and sending the money home again. Well, the net result of all of that is that in the Tumi Valley, and for this reader, 10,000 other valleys in South Africa, you've got people living there in an area that is producing no wealth, but whose breadwinners are out there in Joburg or Cape Town or PE, earning money and sending it home. And there are lots and increasing numbers of unemployed people in those situations, not just women, but men now too. How does one then rethink that rural economy in such a way that people can have decent health care, decent schools, and water laid on? Electricity, a lot has happened in the last 15 years in terms of rural electricity, and something's happening in terms of water. But now how to generate wealth in that economy. And then you've got to start thinking out of the box, not necessarily mealies, but honey or essential oils or things that can be produced there and whose value is sufficient, given the weight of the product, to send it somewhere else and generate money. And I think that kind of thinking is possible, but we're not doing a tremendous amount about it. And I would argue that a place like Ponderland, although, I don't know the details there, I'll stress that, I would imagine that it's wide open for that kind of thinking. In other words, building on what has been there, on the wealth that they have had. It was not as messed up as this side of the Kai River was messed up by the process of conquest, and that there's a base there from which one can grow further. I'm sure there will.